Karen Deeds. This is Bob Deeds. Bob is a retired federal canine handler with Texas Task Force 1, having 15 years of work in the FEMA federal arena. And we're going to talk a little bit about working dogs. We're going to start out by defining what a working dog is. And this is kind of our working definition. A working dog is a dog that is trained to complete a task for a human that cannot do that task with the same success, consistency, or efficiency. I actually kind of like this one because it involves the team effort. The dog is neither tool nor toy. You are partners giving each other advice. Each brings something to the work that the other doesn't have and cannot do alone. And I know those of you who have working dogs, you know what that means. Today we're only going to focus on 4 types of working dogs, because God knows there's plenty of them out there. We're going to talk this morning, or the first session, about military working dogs. So Bob's going to do most of it this first session. And then later this afternoon, we're going to do service dogs, therapy dogs, urban search and rescue dogs, and disaster dogs that Bob did. So I'm going to cover the service and therapy dogs in the early next session, and then Bob will finish up with disaster dogs. One thing that we can look at is all of these dogs have something in common. They work in stressful environments, in stressful situations. That military working dog that is out in the desert doing his job during heavy combat fire, that's a little stressful. That service dog that is out there in New York City with horns blaring and trying to make it from one bus to the next, that's stressful. Even that therapy dog that is in a hospital situation with equipment buzzing and going off, they're trying to console an individual. And of course, we have the disaster search and rescue dogs. I don't know if any of you ever saw any of the pictures of 9/11, but that was his first deployment, was 9/11. And to see the dogs working in that situation, you know that has to be stressful. Another thing these dogs all typically have in common is that they don't have an inherent mechanism to release stress. So what we look at is that they all have similar factors which influence the prospect for getting help. The agency, FEMA, whoever, the military, the organization, the service dog organization, the therapy dog organization, and of course the handler have to all intervene and respond. The handler is the first one to see the behavior problems manifest after placement. What we're talking about is all after placement, not prior to placement. These are the dogs that are actually already working out in the field. They are a team. The handler and the dog are a team. So the agency, organization, and the handler may also be responsible for the funding.
Okay, what we're going to take away today, the state of behavior modification and getting dogs back to work. Okay, this is the main focus here. There's a historical response. We need to understand where we're coming from. Don't want to get bogged down in history, but we have to talk about it. Okay, how far we've come. I want you to look at this. Okay, I am every handler in this presentation today. I'm that person. Okay. I'm bilingual. My English is actually my secondary language. My first language is Baba, okay? So I am every handler we're talking about here. And then we're also going to talk about the future. Where should we be going? We're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about aftercare. We cannot separate aftercare after those dogs are retired. We can't separate what happens with those dogs from the rest of it, because that's actually the gauge of the health of the industry as a whole. Okay, if we're not treating those dogs well later on, we're certainly not going to be treating them well now, and we have to look at that also. Almost all SAR in the U.S. is volunteer. Okay, even paid FEMA handlers work as contract employees. Okay, when I wasn't deployed, I didn't get paid. I was an adjunct instructor at Texas A&M where my task force was based. So I had some other income coming in from that, but unless I was actually out where something had blown up or blown down, I wasn't getting paid. With the exception of sub-agency sponsored handlers, almost all funding is by the handler. And it varies greatly. Even on federal level, there's a wide discrepancy. Okay, my task force was great. They paid for a lot of stuff, but in general, that doesn't happen all over the system. Military funding focused prior to 2013. Their focus was what happened on the front end doing assessments, okay, purchasing dogs, all those tests and assessments they would do early on to get the right dog, and then medical treatment of physical injuries, things that happened in combat, okay. Service dog organizations, they're going to rely on donations. It's a huge part of it, and where money is divvied up is based on what appeals to donors. All right, and then of course, contrary to what people believe in this room, a lot of people don't think that the behavior part's very sexy.
But we do, right? We
Yeah.
like behavior, that's why.
I think it's sexy. All right.
Actually, that's how we met, was working with behavior problems. And,
Actually, I thought she was sexy, but that's a whole different thing. Moving on. I digress. Sorry. Now, notice how easily money became a consideration. Okay. It was a very big part of it. Okay. The importance of assessment and getting the right dog for the job is always going to be a major focus, and it's always going to be the bedrock of prevention. If you don't have the right dog for the job, there's no way you're going to squeeze a square peg into a round hole and make it work. This applies to all working dog disciplines. I don't care if it's herding cattle or what. If that dog is not the right dog, you're not going to turn it into the right dog. Now, awareness of behavioral issues requires education. Okay, that's huge.
that's why you're here, you're getting educated.
All right, big part of it. It's costly. Do you agree with that? All right, had to pay a little bit to be here. All right, and handlers are often taught how to handle dogs and care for dogs' physical needs only. Awareness and education now come into play, and I think it's cool that we have a couple of working dog handlers here that are actually trying to learn something besides just scent propagation. Now, in the past and today, working dog lifespan had had to be considered when we were looking at viability of the behavior protocols, treatment protocols, maintenance, all that stuff, because we have to look at the return on investment. How long is that dog actually going to live? We have to be practical here because we're dealing with money, okay? Your tax dollars, okay? You ask that your money be wisely spent, and even if you don't intend to put this type of social pressure on these organizations, you do, just by the inherent nature of it. In all disciplines, we're looking at about 8 to 10 years as the norm for working life, and believe me, there's some leeway and discrepancy here. Dog average age of certification in a lot of these different disciplines is about 2 years. Retirement is usually around 10 to 12 years, and again, it's going to vary. The therapy service dogs are going to be on the upper end of that scale, maybe even exceeding that. Military working dogs, dogs in the disaster environment, it can be on the lower end of that. You know, I've been on deployments where we had human remains detection dogs, primarily the space shuttle recovery mission. We had HR dogs there that were, worked with one that was 13 years old, and he was still doing great. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. I'm going to throw a little bit of Shakespeare at you today. Now, where the military working dogs are concerned, I want to go back historically and I want to look at something, but I'm not going to go back to when it started. Believe me, we started using dogs for military purpose long before we even had written word. We know that. We've seen the pictures on the walls and caves that prove that. But we're going to look at Vietnam to start with. Around 4,000 dogs were deployed during the entirety of the Vietnam War. That's a huge number. Okay, but to put that into perspective, we deployed about 20,000 during World War II. okay? Now, due in part to bounties on the heads of both dogs and handlers, because dogs were very effective, so the VC wanted to get rid of them. There were about 350 dogs that were killed in action, okay? The number was about 263 handlers were KIA, all right? Officially, dogs were listed as equipment. Anybody get a queasy feeling in their stomach? Okay, they were listed as equipment. They were no different than a tank, a Jeep, a rifle, any type of weapon. They were just listed as equipment. Starting in 1971, where we were getting into the final phase of everything, canines deployed to Vietnam were either abandoned or euthanized. Remember how I said this was going to show kind of the health of what the state of the nation was at this time? Of the 4,000 dogs deployed to Vietnam throughout the entirety of the conflict, about 200 made it back home. And of those 200 that made it back home that were retasked into other positions, at the end of their working lives, most of those dogs were destroyed. It's a very small number, less than 70, I know, that actually ended up living out lives. There's only a single reported case of behavior modification or administration of any behavior protocols during this period. It just wasn't important, all right? One of the three outcomes that typically took place, there's actually four, but three outcomes that we're going to look at was after a period of detox rarely lasting more than 90 days. How many of your dogs do you treat in 90 days and wave bye at the handler, or the owner of the dog? The dog was either reassigned, repurposed, which also included reassignment, or euthanized. Okay, they gave that dog 90 days to come back from all the trauma that it had been exposed to. Now, that single case was for a GSD named Nemo. Nemo was a sentry dog on a base that was attacked by the VC. He fought off an onslaught, was shot through the left eye, continued to fight. Okay, his handler was taken down with injury, was shot. Nemo laid on top of his handler and protected his handler from other VC that were attacking. They eventually got to him. Of course, Nemo was trying to keep the U.S. medics away too, but they were able to get control of him and were able to treat the handler and treat Nemo. Now for Nemo, detoxification was actually prescribed. Okay, there's medical records that show that. And after 6 months, because of physical and psychological injuries, he was still missing an eye. Okay, he was actually retired. Now we're going to fast forward, okay, to 2001. Everybody here knows what happened September 11, 2001. Dogs are still classified as equipment at that time, okay, military working dogs. But a lot of public interest started to happen. How many of you watched events as they unfolded at the World Trade Center? How many of you came home from work and watched stuff? Okay, how many of you got up first thing in the morning and turned the TV on to see kind of what was going on? A lot of people did, okay? A lot of people did. So there was huge interest in what was going on. And canines were a big part of that interest, just because it was kind of a feel-good story in a time when we as a country needed something to make us feel good, all right? There was another thing that happened. How many of you have seen this documentary called War Dogs? Anybody remember it? Got a couple of people in here. Okay, go back. You can find it on VHS all over the place, but I'm sure it's out on DVD now. You may even be able to find it on YouTube. But there was a documentary called War Dogs that actually publicized in great detail what was going on with the Vietnam military working dogs and their plight. And those two things played a huge role in what happened after that. Now, there were several of these bills that passed. I listed one here in 2012. There were 53, this was HR 5314, which passed the House, and there were several bills that were put together. There was a potential for adoption by handlers upon retirement. I don't know if that happened in Vietnam. If it did, it didn't happen more than 1 or 2 times. I actually know people. I have a very good friend of mine that did search and rescue later that named a dog named Pepper. He was actually a handler in Vietnam, and he had to leave his dog behind So as soon as he got his first search and rescue dog, he named that dog Pepper after his military working dog in Vietnam. So the potential of adoption by handlers after retirement was on the table for the first time. Option to place military working dogs as law enforcement dogs. There were some dogs that as they started to reach the end of service, maybe they didn't have everything they needed in place physically to be able to do the demands of the military working dog, but they were capable of doing 25-second vehicle searches. So those dogs were put into law enforcement situations, some of them. There were other situations where these dogs were placed in suitable homes. This is still being done, all of this stuff, being placed in suitable homes. That was kind of cool, all right? There were some of these dogs that just did fine in those situations. There was oversight for the first time in euthanasia of military working dogs. This means that reports actually had to be made, and it's still ongoing. They're made to Congress. They have a committee, I can't even tell you which one, but they do have a committee that looks at that because they want to know every time one of these dogs is put down, and they want to know why it was put down. You see where we're coming to now? It was pretty horrendous. I could see everybody's stomachs churning when we were talking about Vietnam, but look at the gains that we're making, okay? There's bipartisan support, and this is the biggie, changing military working dog status from equipment. It's the mindset. We got to change the mindset, hearts and minds, okay? So we're changing it from equipment to the canine members of the armed forces. And then in 2015, President Obama actually signed all of this into law. All this stuff started back in the Bush administration. It took this long to get everything finally passed through. Now I want to talk to you about a specific person because this is a perfect storm kind of moment. This is a gal named Crystal Ann Tronball. Has anybody heard of her? Anybody know who she is? Crystal is a cool gal. I spoke with her on several occasions via telephone. And she served in the Navy from 2006 to 2011. She spent 2 years in Bahrain. I'm not saying that right, but I can't roll the R's as good as you're supposed to be able to do. She handled a single-purpose explosives dog named Kira. Kira was a pretty cool dog. She developed some issues, though. She had a tendency to do some redirection in her aggression back toward the handler, and she had a tendency to eat other people in close proximity. That's not a good thing, okay, because not everybody's the bad guy. All right, so Crystal started experimenting. This gal is one of the most intuitive people I've ever met. Okay, she does not have a behavior background. I'll guarantee you that even today, as far as the academia is concerned, she has less knowledge than anybody in this room. All right, but she's intuitive as hell. And Crystal started to experiment. She started doing bite work to actually release stress. All right. Now Kira, she was doing such a good job at this bite work that the kennel master over in Bahrain was watching, and he said, "I'm going to retask that dog." So the dog got a new classification. It actually became a dual-purpose dog, which meant that its training regimen changed, and it started to change to include bite work. It's pretty cool, all right? I don't know if any of you have ever thought, I think I'm going to take this aggressive dog and actually do bite work with it. It's pretty unusual, okay? But she did it, and I'm not recommending that because you need to know a little bit about bite work. But she did it, and the success was incredible. We're going to talk more about Kira and Crystal later. But through Crystal's intuitiveness, Kira's aggressive outbursts were almost completely mitigated, and that's just with a minimal amount of management, just normal management. She just had to be smart. She had to start to tell when Crystal was becoming agitated and not put her in that situation. And of course, the levels of agitation begin to diminish and come less frequently. A couple of pictures here. This is Crystal and Kira, and then over there, notice that plane in the background? Okay, that's Air Force One. She had just finished sweeping that over to in Bahrain. I'm not sure if it was President Obama or if it was somebody else in the plane, but anyway, that's pretty cool. The Devil Dog of San Diego, military working dog, Damien, military working dog number 214. Has anybody ever heard of Damien? Okay, that's not a misprint up there. There is actually 2 D's in front of that dog's name. You guys know this. Anybody who deals with litters and breeding, a lot of times breeders will do alphabet, litters. You'll have like an A litter, B litter. Well, this was the second D litter. Damien was actually he was a Malinois GSD cross. Boy, that's risky. But a Malinois GSD cross, Lackland Air Force Base bred. They've had some pretty successful litters with those dogs, and he was born in 2001. Damien had 7 deployments in his career. Okay, that's a lot. All right. He also had more explosive finds than any other dog from the U.S., and he went through 9 handlers in his career, biting each one of them at least once. That was what was reported. I have a feeling there were more bites than that, and that doesn't include peripheral nips occasionally, okay, to other people. Now, Crystal Ann had a knee injury, and she was retasked back to San Diego. She was put on kennel duty, and about the same time she was back there, guess who came through? Okay, military working dog Damien. And she met him. He had been rotated home, and without having a clue, classical conditioning became her best friend. Again, she didn't know anything about behavior. She was just kind of intuitive about trying to solve problems. Now, after a month of toxin cookies, every time she opened the kennel door, and the way the kennel was configured, there was a door that opened this way, there was a wall here that went up about this high, and then you would walk around the corner and there would be the entrances to the kennel, okay, all the way down, multiple entrances. And Damien was in this first run here, and she would open the door, ring the bell, get the treat. Very simple. She didn't know that, but that's what she was doing. She thought, man, this dog's going nuts. There's no way I'm going to be able to come around the corner and even get in the crate with this dog because he's going absolutely crazy. So she'd open the door, throw the cookie over. Close the door, open the door, throw the cookie over, close the door. Wouldn't go in. She just did that multiple times a day. And then she goes, wow, he's not barking as much. Wow, I can actually hear his tail scraping on the ground. Okay, I'm going to walk around the corner. Walk around the corner, he starts going nuts. She throws a cookie in and backs away. Okay, treat and retreat in kind of a reverse sense. She was the one retreating. He didn't have a lot of room to go away. So she would throw the cookie, back away, throw the cookie, back away. The tail started. She would actually stand there, okay, throw the cookie, all right, he'd come back up, she'd reach for the door, throw the cookie, reach for the door, throw the cookie, you know the process. Go all the way in until she could handle the dog. She was the first one to actually administer treatment without sedation with that dog. She didn't realize that till after she did it, and somebody said, he didn't eat you? It's also kind of a funny side note, when she went in there, or the day that she was given that assignment, there were 2 other people working the kennel and they were sick that day all of a sudden. Don't know what happened. They didn't show up for work that day, so she really got stuck with this. Now, Damien, due to his age and the number of tours, was not retasked. Again, this whole behavior modification stuff was still pretty new. In 2010, he was diagnosed with canine PTSD and released from service. And this is important. Okay, he was already home when he was diagnosed with this. And you say, well, why wasn't he diagnosed sooner? We're going to talk about that. Even with his aggressive history, he was allowed to be adopted. Okay, Crystal Ann actually took him home. Now, in the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you some photos here, and there's some pretty interesting information on here as far as illustration of deployment history and behavior as reported to the veterinarian. You can see up here you have his deployments. Part of that's cut off, but that's 1 deployment, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. You have Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, 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 Iraq. I looked at that, I told Crystal, I said, well, he's a slacker, he never went to Afghanistan. Now this is pretty neat. Of course, it's a government document, so we have to have redactions. You got to do that. But I want you to look at this. I'm going to read this because it's kind of hard to read from where you're at. It says, handler reports episodes of explosive induced behavior, altercation, Handler says he gets agitated and starts barking, otherwise healthy. That's what the handler and the downrange veterinarian discussed. This was before the dog came back to the States. Now, I also talked to Sergio Sandoval. He was actually Damien's last handler, okay? I want you to look at this. Sergio's a canine handler for a police department in Florida now, but this is what he said. If I'd have known then what I know now, I'd have said something sooner. Okay, Damien was actually refusing to work when these outbursts occurred. And Sergio did what most handlers in that mindset in that time did. He forced his dog to work. Okay, he just did not recognize it because he didn't have the education, he didn't have the knowledge to say, you know, this could be part of a bigger problem. All right, there's another thing that happens too. I've been through this. Any of you guys that have working dogs, have you ever washed a dog out before? You haven't? You were much smarter than me when you started. Okay, I actually had to wash a dog out one time, and man, I felt so guilty. I had failed this dog. Okay, I had let this dog down. This dog was going, thank God I don't have to do that anymore because I'm not suitable for it. But we take it personally, and we have a feeling we feel guilty when a dog washes out. And I know all the stuff he was going through, so I'm not going to beat him up over not saying something sooner because I understand exactly where he was coming from. There's a picture here of military working dog Damien and Petty Officer First Class at that time, Sandoval. I have a feeling that's probably ammonium nitrate there in the background. It's the same, part of the same component that was used to blow up Oklahoma City, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. The thought processes were beginning to change. Okay, now, I talked with Dr. Walter Burghardt. He's in charge of behavior, okay, at Lackland Air Force Base. And I asked him specifically, what is canine PTSD? And he said, canine PTSD is only diagnosed for those dogs experience clinical signs, and then he listed them: distress, escape, avoidance, task failure, during or after combat. That's critical. Noise sensitivity, this is the sick there or other behavior elements he listed separately, but I put it in here, could be diagnosed in any patient not in a combat environment. So it's the same thing clinically, it's just set up a little bit differently. So possibly some of the trigger mechanisms are going to be different, you know, in the way the dog is triggered to begin with. Now currently all military veterinarians receive about 45 hours of behavior training. Okay, that's more than your local vets get. Okay, much more. All right, and I was really impressed when he told me that. That's what's currently going on. Training modalities are much more likely to focus on positive reinforcement-based training. I've worked with a lot of the military trainers, a lot of military handlers, and they're actually doing some pretty cool stuff now. Especially with the focus on IEDs and a lot of stuff that's at a distance. You can't, well, one of their tools that they would use a lot to force lengthening an indication, a trained indication, which for an explosives object would be a sit, a passive indication. If the dog would start to get up, they would apply pressure with a shock collar. That was typical. Okay, you can't do that with explosives, okay, because if the explosives are wired into the same frequency, you go boom. All right, so that's not even a training option that you can use. Blowing up is bad, it's always bad. So training modalities are more likely to focus on positive reinforcement-based methods. Appropriate medication and modification protocols are explored. And this is downrange, all this stuff they're looking at. Although rare, a dog that is receiving medication for behavior issues might still be placed in the field. All right, now when I talked to Dr. Burghardt, he said at that time, he didn't know of any dogs in the field that were on medication, but he said he personally had sent some recommendations to one of the downrange veterinarians in multiple cases to do that the dog would be fine while they were finishing up protocols. and then tailored medical and behavior management for each dog. Telemedicine, okay, that wasn't around during Vietnam. We can actually talk to people in the field. We can use laptops and actually see what's going on. We can look at behavior. There's things that we couldn't do before. There's still an issue with handlers recognizing and reporting behavioral issues. I think a lot of that, I know a lot of that has to do with lack of education. Without treatment, 75% of the dogs with PTSD will be lost without treatment. Success, once identified, is upward of 90%. That's pretty cool. All right, now recidivism, those numbers are a little bit fuzzy, and part of it is when they looked at retasking, there's still some debate over whether that's a success because they're having to put the dog into a different job. I personally think it is. Okay, they're retasking that dog. The dog is happy, the dog is working, and dogs are in over 200 different locations worldwide. So that's a pretty big deal. Something that surprised me is he told me that right now, today, this may be different tomorrow, the number could double, but right now, today, we've only got about 250 dogs, military working dogs. This doesn't include contract dogs that are deployed around the world right now. There's not that many out there right now. We do a lot of contract stuff though. Non-PTSD diagnosed issues are usually handled downrange at current duty stations with canine handlers. They tell the handler, this is what you do. This is what I want you to do. Bob Bailey talks about training as a mechanical skill, okay? I suppose behavior modification can also be just explaining to them what you want done. Medication is available if prescribed. Protocols include, but are not limited to, desensitization, counter-conditioning, detoxification, and of course retasking if necessary. Notice, this is nothing fancy. Okay, this is nothing that you're not doing with client dogs here. Special operations canines, this is a whole different thing, okay, because these dogs are trained for the needs of special operations, okay. I have talked to people about what's done and they can't even disclose everything, all right. It's a proverbial deal about, if we tell you, we'll have to kill you kind of deal. So, and I'm not going to argue with those guys because they're capable of doing it. Because of the needs and nature of special forces, those operators are usually not there to do the protocols. Their phone goes off, they got to go somewhere. So they'll have other people actually doing that. They have kennel techs and vets and trainers that are actually doing these protocols. The numbers and information regarding these dogs was not made available to us. I asked Dr. Burkhardt, I said, do you know these numbers? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what are they? And he said, I'm not going to tell you. So I didn't argue. But behavioral issues, he did tell me this, were more likely to be recognized and reported. All right, and I think I know why. We'll talk about that here in a second. Once reported, success with behavior modification was in line with regular military working dogs. But they're still going to be probably saving a higher number because more stuff's being reported. All right, so special operations also, when we look at this, because there's so much information that's left open, I'm going to read between the lines on a lot of this. Am I right? I don't know. My wife will be inclined to tell you I'm probably wrong, but that's just in general. But I believe that special operation handlers, in fact, I know this for a fact, they have a huge budget. All right, and the ability to control peripheral instruction in areas such as canine behavior is kind of up to them. Karen and I were at a Bob Bailey chicken workshop several years ago, and it was Baltimore, Maryland. It was up in Baltimore, and there were two handlers that had, or trainers that had come in from Fort Bragg. Okay, when they got there, I said, you guys train dogs for Green Berets? And they said, yes. And I said, what about Delta Force? And they looked at each other and winked at me and said, who? So, yes, okay, they train dogs for both of those groups. Now, and it just goes to show you, they can kind of pick and choose. You're not going to see regular soldier, regular airman, regular Navy canine handlers going to a lot of workshops because of the money involved, okay? but the special operations guys, they can pick and choose what they want to do. Prevention, and this applies mainly to Navy SEAL dogs, but this blew me away. Only 1% of the dogs that start the program are actually allowed to finish training, certified, and deployed. That's actually a lower rate of success than what the Navy SEALs themselves have. Only 1%. So their selection process up front is off the frickin' chart. Now, we're going to take a break here in a little bit. We have some more time. We've got about, 20 minutes? Something like that. What I want to do is I want to take some questions and I want to discuss some of this. And I know there's some people that may not be at the second part of this because they're going to go see some other stuff, and I understand that. So I want to get some questions in now. The other thing is I want you to think in terms of what you would like to see. And if you are going to be back to the second half, we have something we discussed at the very end of this. It's called a wish list. It's just where we're going. And I'm curious to see if what you say now ends up on that list. Anybody have any questions right off the bat? Anybody have any answers? That's even more important. Yes? What are the qualifications of what?
Picking out a good therapy dog.
Oh, okay. I'm going to let Karen talk about that, and then if anybody wants to know too, we'll talk about assessment for both military working dogs and SAR dogs. We'll talk about that a little bit.
That's a really great question, and I don't think there's a specific answer. I think that there are no guidelines that are required. We talked about that later this afternoon, and that's part of our problem, is the selection process of the dogs. It is a big part of the problem with service and therapy dogs. I know there are organizations out there that use only rescues. There are organizations that only breed dogs. The organization that I worked with last was a group in Michigan, and we bred our own dogs. We also had donations from other breeders. And we did, for a little while, try to use some rescues. I actually procured probably about 8 dogs for the organization. And of those 8 dogs that I sent to Michigan, only 1 made the cut. It was a little Westie named Ice.
Yeah, remember Ice. We used to have a heck of a time keeping him out of our dishwasher.
Yeah, he was a little shit.
That is the correct vernacular for a dog that size, in case you wanted to know. It's LSD, little shit dog. That's what they're called.
But the breeding program that the organization I worked for, we were about a 70% success rate. That was pretty great back then, and I don't know if it's still as good. I don't know if things have gotten better or worse. But that is, I think, probably the biggest problem in the industry, is the appropriateness of the dogs out there. And you'll hear me say that later this afternoon. And therapy dogs, same thing. I do a lot of presentations and do a lot of body language presentations. And I remember doing one in Midland, Texas, which is pretty much BFE. It's the middle of nowhere. And there was a lady there who's very, very proud to have her dog as a therapy dog. And so I was actually doing a little bit of demonstration of what I know of the Clothier Animal Response Assessment tool, which is basically observe the dog and see what you get. And I sat in the middle of the room. She let her lovely little therapy dog out, and it went. And it stayed as far away from me as it could get, and stayed right next to Mommy. And if Mommy took a step closer to me, the dog did too. So the therapy dog was not necessarily, in my opinion, wanting to do the work, but was willing to do the work because Mommy wanted it to do the work. And I personally have a problem with that, but she didn't see it. So, and the dog is certified as a therapy dog. So that's a great question. Sadly, there is no answer. I know there's a group down in Texas that has kind of a nice little flow chart. Service Dogs Inc. has a nice little flow chart. I don't know how old it is. I've worked for them for a while as well. So yes, any other questions?
Yes.
So it's kind of a piggyback off that. So I'm the behavior manager at the shelter that I work in.
Uh-huh.
Always get questions, people searching for service dogs, and I generally ask them to bring whoever's going to be training that service dog in with them. They can feel free to do their own behavior assessments. But what we do at our shelter is that we have some of our dogs are canine good citizen certified.
Great.
So I try to like filter them. I mean, is that like?
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you something too that you might want to look at. If you will contact us after this, like through Facebook or something, get a hold of us, we could probably tell you a little bit more about what to look for, especially in the shelter type deal, to put them into a potential working dog home. When Karen and I, we first met in '98. I was on a volunteer search and rescue team, and the canine director hired her. We didn't pay her anything, but they hired her to work with a bunch of Bubbas. I guess I fell in that category, who knew nothing about this newfangled deal called the clicker. All right, and because prior to that, I mean, I used shock collars, choke chains, pinch collars, occasional 2x4, and if that didn't work, you'd smack your dog with a small child, whatever you needed to do to get the behavior that you needed. And I knew nothing about it. And anyway, we met Karen, and then fast forward to 2002. We were in a group. We were asked to be in a group called the Gifted Animal Placement Program. And what this did is it taught people who worked in shelters and kennels and even rescue groups how to recognize potentially gifted animals that could go on and do work. It was cool, and we were looking at stuff from, hey, this dog would be really suitable for fly ball, up to, this dog should be a disaster search and rescue dog, therapy or a service dog. We placed, and still do, we place hundreds of dogs from shelters.
So actually a lot easier to find a detection dog, whether it's USAR, narcotics, arson, termite, conservation. We've placed 3 dogs in the last 6 months doing working dogs for conservation. We have one in Africa right now who's doing elephant ivory and rhinoceros horn poached. And yes, she does have a bounty on her head. She's taken very well care of over there. The handlers love their dogs. They love their dogs. But it's a lot easier to find those crazy ass suckers than it is those nice dogs, because everybody wants the nice dog.
In fact, we used to try to find dogs for each other. It was hilarious. I'd take a dog that I thought, okay, this dog does not have the drive, and I'd say, Karen, look at this dog, it'll be perfect. Because the nerve strength is what we're looking at. We need a dog that's going to be unflappable in a stressful environment, or it's going to rebound quickly if it gets a little flappable. And I would get this dog to Karen, and Karen would look at the dog and she'd go, are you nuts? This dog's crazy. And then she'd send a dog to me, and this dog has really good drive, and I'd look at it and I said, the dog doesn't even have air drive. There's nothing here that I can use. And it took us a long time to realize that the component that we needed to look for first was nerve strength. Once we had nerve strength in place, then we could look at the other components, the different drive components, and see where that dog needed to go.
That's a really big thing with service and therapy dogs, is they have to have that, what he calls the nerve strength. It is the confidence and the resiliency. If they go over, for those of you who were in my presentation yesterday in Whose Best Interest, I talked about arousal and resiliency. And if a dog gets spooked, that's fine, that's understandable, but how quickly do they recover? And that's really important with a service dog, or a therapy dog, or a narcotics dog, or a disaster search and rescue dog. And more than likely, in a military working dog, they can't have any kind of, oh my God, they can't have that startle response.
Really, the search and rescue dogs, you don't want it there. The environments are always different. I'll give you an example. I flew to, I think we were somewhere in Alabama or Georgia, I don't remember. Anyway, we were on a coastal area after a hurricane, and we got there, we unloaded off of our transportation, and the first task we were given was to search a 17-story building. The bottom 3 floors had been blown out, so we couldn't access it. The sand was too soft, too unstable to bring a ladder truck up. So they got a hold of U.S. Customs, and we borrowed one of their helicopters. They flew it in, we loaded up, and then we fast roped down to the top of the building. And the entire time this process was taking place, my dog was going, "I'm going to Six Flags." You know, normal dogs don't do that. You know, most dogs, yeah, yeah, she is, I've taken her to the dark side. Where your dogs may counter surf, or you may have a client dog that counter surfs, mine can get on the counter and on top of the refrigerator to get that loaf of bread. So.
This is a wish list question, probably for the second part of it. Many of us work with working breed dogs or breed dog mixes that are placed into pet homes. And one of the questions, things that could be helpful, I think, for us is what do we do with those dogs? What are appropriate outlets? How can we really guide people in particular ways, activities, welfare, things that we can do to help offset the fact that we have a working dog sitting in the middle of something.
And those are the dogs that are so hard. The working dogs that aren't quite, the working breeds of dogs that aren't quite there for real work.
Right.
And they've ended up in a pet home, yeah, those suck.
Worst dogs to deal with, and we know that.
And in all honesty, so what do you do? To me, that's a lot of mental stimulation. And there are so many wonderful sports out there. I'm actually, I compete in sports. I do just obedience and rally, but at a pretty high level. And I think nose work is probably one of the most fabulous things for stressed dogs, for overly active dogs, because it engages the seeking system in the brain, and it gets them using their instincts. And of course, then you have just freaking train your dog. You've got to do something with these dogs. They're not going to be couch potatoes. And I know Chris talked about it earlier this morning, and I certainly talk about the option of rehoming. Some homes are just not suitable. In fact, just yesterday we got an email. We did a board and train with a little chocolate lab, and he's about 10 months old when we got him, and of course we're drooling because this dog is working dog material. And he belongs to this very sedentary, quiet couple with a little boy.
The little boy is borderline autistic. There's some stuff going on there.
So we did the training with him. We actually did the assessment to see if he could pass what we call the gap assessment, which is to determine if he has the drive, the hunt, the nerve strength, and he passed. And so when they came and they picked up their dog and we're doing the send home, I'm like, look guys, square peg, round hole. This dog is not suitable for your lifestyle, I don't believe. But we've given you some tools that you can work with. And they had him home for about 4 months. He actually was in boarding just last week. We got the email yesterday. We agreed. Jake's not.
We're ready.
We're ready to let Jake go on to what his special purpose in life might be. So we're going to be getting the chocolate lab in, and he'll either become a conservation dog. Actually, I think we have a USAR handler looking. So
something to think about when you work with clients, if you come across one of these dogs, and it's up to you, but like what we do in this situation is we say, look, you just spent a lot of money to have us train your dog. Training's not the option here, okay? So what we'll do is we're gonna help you find another dog, a replacement for this dog. We're gonna go ahead and train this other dog for free. We don't make any money off of placing these dogs, but this is just what we do. So that may be a viable option. And you talk about goodwill. All right, I guarantee you I'm going to get 20 referrals from this client just for that. So that's something to think about.
a marketing ploy as well. Any other questions? Did that answer your question at all?
Not really, but it wasn't really a question. It was really just posing some things as you're walking through in that wish list category.
The biggest thing with these dogs is find a niche for them to do something. And it may be that you have to start that process before the client ever gets the dog. You know.
When we see them, we're way past that.
Okay, you're past that point.
We're past that point.
But introduce stuff. I do created a sport called geoscenting. Anybody here know what geocaching is?
Yeah.
Okay, geoscenting is where we train our dog to find scented caches. All right, and so I started a sport called geoscenting because you don't have to go to a trial. So if it's a dog, let's say the dog has reactivity issues with people or other dogs, you don't need anybody else around. Okay, you can go out. You may have to find a cache first, scent it. but then teach that dog, to find that odor. Now that dog actually has a purpose, and it's pretty cool. And there's, this, I bet you within 10 miles of this building, there's probably 15 geocaches. They're just all over the place. So it's really, really cool to do.
We're talking working dogs.
I understand.
Yeah. and-
But it's that have a lot of those qualities of working dogs, but not quite. Maybe the nerve strength is missing, but so I feel your pain. Those are hard. Yes.
I have a wish list question.
Yeah.
So our organization, we take dogs from shelters and we have a guided training program for PTSD service dogs. We work with combat veterans.
Cool.
So it's so cool. Our clientele is actually the veterans themselves. So it works in twofold that they get their service dog. We don't have a waiting list because the classes are rotating, and then it helps in the, makes them proactive in their treatment for their PTSD because they have to come to class, they have to do public access lessons. So in class, we teach them just for their tasks, very simple like buffering techniques and things and grounding because, we're dealing with people who already kind of are limited emotionally, so we try to keep it as easy so that they can be successful. But we're at a point now in our program where we'd like to do an advanced task training.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be curious to see what some of your suggestions are for somebody who's was a plumber. What can he teach his dog? Not what I can teach the dog advanced tasks, but to help with PTSD and TBI and things like that they can teach themselves.
In all honesty, I have no clue because it's going to be customized for the individual. I mean, a service dog task is meant to mitigate part of their disability. What is their disability? You have to define that first. What does a dog need to be trained to help them with? You want to do some fun shit, teach them to open and close drawers. I don't care.
Right.
But so those are some retrieve. That's typically a very easy one. And I do believe that a lot of clients enjoy teaching their dogs to retrieve. Heck, we get a lot of our clients that have pet dogs, and we get the kids involved, and we teach them service dog tasks. Oh my God, they teach the dogs their own pet dogs to retrieve, to open doors, to close doors, to open, close drawers. We walked into a home one time, and the little 12-year-old son, who has some emotional issues, has now been working with his dog, and we walk into the kitchen, and all of the drawers are open. He's like, watch this. Close it. Boom. The dog closes every drawer, and this little kid is beaming. He is now the center of attention in his cul-de-sac. So even though that dog was not, as a pet dog, was not meant to give that, to do any type of service work or therapy work or emotional work for that child, it certainly did. So could you call that a service dog? No, because it doesn't have public access. And I'm not even going to get into the ESA part of things.
And there's something to look at here. You remember I mentioned up here about mindset and mindset changes, training modalities, the way that they've changed. The military used to, well, they still do it, but they do other stuff now. You'll either have a bucket or an ammo can with rocks in it, and for the first couple of weeks, you practice doing corrections, okay, and praise. All right, they have a mantra that they go through. All right, so they'll practice doing that to begin with. And with these dogs, as they start to change their method of training, the mind also changes. So giving them tasks that they can train, where instead of doing, the bucket with corrections, they're actually attacking a certain task, training it with positive reinforcement-based training so that it changes their mindset. That's what, in my opinion, that's what you need to focus on. Those are the things that they need to do. And it doesn't matter so much what it is, unless they have a specific task they need. If they've also got some physical disability, they may need a dog that can go pick up a remote control, do important stuff like get beer from the refrigerator,
Probably not. I do know some dogs that are actually responsible for listening to a timer on their watch to go get medication, that kind of thing. So those are certainly some tasks that could probably be trained for people with PTSD. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Yes.
You mentioned some rehabilitation within military working dogs.
Mm-hmm.
How about within the service dog?
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that this afternoon.
This is a two-part harder?
Okay, so you will touch on
Yeah.
actual-
Well, and
Yeah.
actually, is there any?
And that's one of the things to
Okay,
consider. We're going to
well,
talk about a lot of common problems.
We talked
And,
about it. Chris
yeah.
talked about it earlier today. What is the most common denominator for working with behavior problems? A handler. Do you have handlers that can handle severe behavior problems? No.
Most of the handlers have severe problems themselves.
You know, there may be.
And you just answered your own question.
There may be, but
So I
we're
just
going to
finished my
explore
comment.
that
We're good to
at
go.
length. I will tell you in fact, it's really interesting, going back to what we said about how important selection is in these processes.
That's,
It is and will always be the most important part of it, because if I have a dog that doesn't have the nerve strength to do the job, I will 1,000% guarantee you that there's going to be a problem. I was at a PetSmart in Lake Worth, which is where we live outside of Fort Worth, several years ago, and had a cop walk up behind me. And he said, "Are you Bob Deeds?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I've got a question for you." And he had his police dog there with him. And the police dog was standing there shaking. And I said, "Is he okay?" He said, "Well, I'm working on it." And I said, "What's the deal?" He said, "He freaks out over slick surfaces." And I said, "Well, let's get him out of the slick surface. Let's go out here and talk." So we went outside. And I said, "How long has this been going on?" And he said, "Since the very first training that I sent him into a building on a slick surface." Uh-oh. He said, "What can I do about that?" And I said, "Get another dog." That's it. You're not going to fix something like that.
Here's kind of where my question came in. Like her behind me, we train, my organization trains service dogs for PTSD, TBI, stuff like that. Once the dogs have been matched with handlers, and after about a year and a half handoff, the dogs can sometimes change their mental. They latch on so hard with the veteran that has mental issues.
They start to pick up
Yes, and they become
everything coming up the leash. Yeah.
And that's where we're struggling. Can you wash the dog out after 2 years and it was a perfect dog?
And again, this is where giving that handler side task. I want you to start working on a specific thing, and it could be something. I tell you what, every one of those handlers is going to find scent detection sexy. They are. And believe me, when I'm working with a client, I may not use that term, but I'm trying to find what's going to be sexy for that client. So find that thing that they can teach their dog and give them a task. All right? You'll start to see that a lot of those problems will be solved, because I don't care, you guys have heard this a million times, and it applies to every species. Knowledge is truly power. All right? And so you enable both the dog and the handler to do something new, and it's just an enrichment. It's just another form of enrichment.
but like Chris was talking about, I mean, if this is truly anxiety, fearing the unknown is basically what anxiety is. So you have to create a lot of predictability. And if your clients don't have predictability, it is going to affect some of those dogs that are prone to anxiety. So guess what? It's going right back into picking the right dog for that client. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with ADI, I'm sure you are, Assistance Dogs International. Their minimum standards. Do you realize, shit, I might as well just do my presentation now. Their minimum standards for PTSD dogs exceed their minimum standards for non-PTSD dogs 100-fold.
And part of it is because of the very reason you're talking about. One of the things you might also need to do is relook or take another look at your assessment program. See if you're seeing this stuff start to happen on a consistent basis, and you look at the handler, and the handler seems like they've got it together pretty good, then it may be an assessment issue. The sad part about it, and you guys already know this, there's not a quick fix for any of this stuff.
And I have to admit, of all of the PTSD dogs that I've known, they last 3 years. 3 years. 3. That's average. 3 years working.